Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first session for the security stream in the GSE virtual conference. Our first session is with Michael McKay from Rocket Software. And it's going to be Think Your Mainframe Secure, Think Again. Please, throughout the session, put questions in the chat and I'll field them to Michael. Then towards the end of the session, we can look to unmute and we can ask any questions then if you don't want to put them in the chat. Without further ado, Michael, over to you.
Today's session is about mainframe security and about how the notion of your mainframe being secure and hackable is not actually quite accurate. We're going to go over a couple of different examples about mainframes that were exploited in the past. We're going to talk about how my organization, Rocket Software, is involved in the security space and kind of some anecdotal things that we've seen. And we're going to kind of bust some general myths. So if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Otherwise, I can take them at the end of the session as well. So who am I? I'm Mike McKay. I'm a senior sales engineer at Rocket Software. I worked before working here. I've been here about 2 years. Before this, I worked at Clydesdale Bank up in Scotland, which then became Virgin Money, which is now becoming nationwide. So lots of change. But I was there for about 7 years or so. I worked in the mainframe storage team and then the mainframe sysprog team. So whilst I've never had much of a security background, it's something I've been in the last kind of year thrown into due to acquisitions of Rocket. But certainly as a sysprog, I've seen some aspects of security, mostly on the compliance side. Running compliance audits in in our environments, and then looking to see what sort of potential issues we need to fix. So I do have end user experience going over to a vendor. Then you may have seen me before other GSEs. I've been to the GSE UK virtual for 2 sessions last year, and the last 2 GSE UKs in person as well. So we're just going to lightly start off with some statistics, which I'm sure some of you might be familiar with. But we all know here that the mainframe is really critical to the global economy. Z systems store 75% of all mainframe data. 71% or so of Fortune 500 companies use mainframes. 90% of credit card transactions are ran via mainframe, and that's 30 billion plus transactions per day. We actually see quite a lot of year-on-year revenue growth for Z systems as well. In a lot of the most important banks, airliners, insurance companies especially, mainframes are highly present, and especially in those 3 organizations, it's a heavy regulated landscape, right? So security is really top on the priority list. And we've actually issued a few security surveys ourselves from Rocket over the years, particularly recently, and there's very clearly a big trend increasing in spend and focus on security. But more on that in a minute. Looking at today's kind of threat landscape, 82% of people who manage mainframes across these enterprise organizations think that the mainframe is extremely safe or very secure. I was in this camp as well when I was an end user. Very much of the opinion, it's the safest computer system ever made. It's pretty much unhackable. But it's really not actually the case. It's a very secure system, and it's we like to call it very securable, right? It's maybe the most securable system on the planet, so it can be the safest. But if you don't take the correct steps to securing your mainframe, certainly can be easily exploitable, just like any other computer system. Stat here in the middle, it's pretty interesting. 91% of mainframe organizations have had a compromise or breach of data in the last 5 years. So compromises are common. This is not necessarily on their mainframe platform. It could be on distributed platforms as well. But, hackers are in the networks of these organizations waiting to pounce. and you always have to be wary of that. But despite all of this, only kind of 41% of organizations do take steps to secure the mainframe. So a lot of orgs are getting breached. A lot of orgs think the mainframe is very safe, but less than half actually take steps to secure it. Why is that? Well, it's possibly because of what I just said. Organizations think, oh, well, we're getting hacked, but it's not on the mainframe, or I've never heard of anyone getting hacked to the mainframe before. Let's spend our security budget elsewhere. Um, However, that is slowly changing. The average cost of a security breach per incident is 4.45 million. That's an average stat. So you think in an enterprise organization, a big bank or something, it's going to be even bigger than that, an even higher amount. And a last couple stats here, CIOs, 2/3 of them expect to increase security investments in 2023 and it's 2024. Um, and what's quite interesting as well here, tagging on the end, is that nearly 68% of organizations have had an open source security vulnerability in the past 2 years. Um, if you've seen me in any GSE sessions in the past, I usually deliver this track on open source tools. As some of you may know, a lot of open source tools have been ported onto the mainframe, which is really nice. Things like curl, things like Git, OpenSSL, if you want to talk about security related tools. And they're very useful, and people are building CI/CD models and DevOps pipelines with these tools, and that's really cool. But you're also introducing a risk onto your mainframe, just as you are when you put it up to distributed platform with data replication and virtualization. You're taking your mainframe, the black box in the corner of your data center that doesn't really talk to much, and you're making it an open platform. And as such, you're opening it to more threats. And a lot of vulnerabilities can actually come from and be exploited uh, that are open source tools. So it's always something to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about open source tools in a minute. But maybe have a think about your organization. Does anyone use open source tools, particularly on key systems, right? Maybe your production systems. Certainly, they'll almost 100% be present on your development systems. And are they getting patched regularly, right? If you have an old version of Git, there's CVEs out there from as recent as kind of 7-8 months ago that really should be patched. So, talking a little bit more about security budgets in 2023, the budgets are to remain robust. This was from my Gartner 2023 study that was produced, or a survey rather. And as you can see here, 42% are increasing and growing relative to inflation. 41% will increase but stay relatively similar to inflation. And then, sorry, to clarify what these numbers mean, the question was, how do you anticipate your cybersecurity information security budget changing in 2023? So well over 80 to 83% are increasing, either staying the same or increasing their security budget. A couple organizations here are either cutting down or staying steady, and then some are unsure. But the general trend is more people are spending money in the security space. So I always find in GSC the audiences are technical-minded people. They're maybe more end users, like what I used to be as sysprogs and the like. But maybe there's some security and compliance leaders here in the session as well. So I like to pose the question to some of them is, what keeps you up at night from a security perspective, particularly on the mainframe? And I think there's really two answers here. One is integrity / system vulnerabilities, right? So, how do I myself identify and locate threats across the systems? And this is a preemptive check, right? As I said, people could be on your network today. How are you going to stop them from getting access to your main systems? Maybe things like multi-factor authentication can stop. Maybe things like patching your software can stop them, right? So how do you preemptively mitigate any threats? And then the other half of the coin is all about compliance. So how do you meet the compliancy standards set in the ever-changing regulatory landscape, right? So we have DORA coming in. I don't know how familiar everyone is with DORA here. It's the Digital Operational Resiliency Act. It's an EU act, so it's not coming into the UK, but some of your organizations are held to EU standards. I think of a company like HSBC that has a headquarters in Germany as well. Even though it's based out the UK, it still has to comply with EU standards to some extent. Also things like GDPR, PCI DSS, right? So there's definitely standards coming in here through these regulatory bills. For an example, DORA, very strict requirement of DORA is that you need to do a pen test in your system every 3 years. That could be a very easy use case or example here. But a lot of other regulations have various different requirements. You're going to get audited. So how do you meet the complex and ever-changing standards set by the kind of government in our area? And I do believe DORA is going to be essentially reworded in some sort of way and probably brought into the UK as these things kind of normally do filter through. So in today's mainframe security environment, there are some threats or potential threats that we face. And here's what we know today. So we know that mainframe usage is increasing to support digital transformation. And I'm going to tag that along with the second one, that companies are integrating mainframe into modern development cycles, right? So organizations are building DevOps pipelines, they're connecting their mainframe to Git, uh, they're doing this, they're replicating DB2 to Postgres and replicating back and doing all these things. And the mainframe is no longer the kind of air-gapped system in the back of the data center. Of course, it can be for some organizations, but it's becoming less so. We also know that companies are integrating but forgetting to modernize their mainframe security. This is generally seen from what I've seen in the field because organizations don't treat mainframes as an asset in their risk and compliance standards compared to anything else. So the mainframe is special in a way, and it's special in that they don't have to look at it as intensely. So yeah, we'll get back to that a little bit later. Um, Companies also forget to properly test or secure all components in the mainframe environment. We talk about things like open source tools that are getting downloaded. Um, what about vendor software? Are you looking at your vendor software, or do you just trust your vendor to give you a vulnerability-free piece of software when you buy it? Companies also don't understand that they need mainframe security tools to try and fill in the gaps with third-party resources. So, I mean, this could be things like compliancy, right? You might have a team that manages your ESMs, right? So your RACF databases, ECF2 or top secret as well. But maybe you need tools to assist these people. We always talk about the skills gap in mainframe. People are retiring. It's harder to find young people to come in and do the jobs. Maybe they have lack of experience. Tools can really help to plug the gap here. We also know that software and applications are still the biggest attack vector. And we also know that you have to think about the mainframe in the way you think about any other computing platform when it comes to compliance and runnability. And this is changing, at least from what I've seen. It's some organizations and some bigger banks in the UK that I've spoke to recently have told me, we're starting to see the mainframe as not so special that they're evaluating the same as any other computer system that they have in their environment. I think that's really important, and as more and more organizations start to do that, start to ensure that the mainframe is getting pen tested, ensure that it's getting compliancy scanned or vulnerability scanned, scanning the applications, scanning the networks, in line with anything else that they're currently managing as a managed resource. You'll start to see maybe some stricter standards coming out of the mainframe. So here's some security myths about the mainframe. Number one is that the mainframe is the most inherently secure system on the planet. Like I said, that's simply a myth. It is the most secureable system. So if you take the proper steps to secure it, it can be really, really difficult to break into. But it's not inherently that way, right? You do have to manage your ESMs, manage your RACF environment, make sure that you have multi-factor authentication. Be careful with what software you download on the mainframe, make sure it's patched, things like that. You may say, oh, well, the mainframe's never been hacked before. And that's simply not true. And we'll talk about a case of mainframe getting hacked here in a minute. There's no need for extra security because the mainframe is behind a firewall. And like I said, people are in your network today, um, in most big organizations. So it's not really something that you can rely on, a firewall protecting you from everything. Using enterprise security managers, your ESMs like RACF, for example, can secure our users and our data sets from malicious threats. That's wrong on a multitude of reasons, right? First of all, your RACF could actually be configured incorrectly. You may have, say, a user leaves to another department in your organization. Are you keeping on top of that? Are you making sure his account is deleted? Are you making sure their data sets are associated data sets are deleted? Access is revoked, things like that. That might always be the case. And also, hackers, if you can get on the system, can actually exploit vulnerabilities in the operating system layer, which is completely separated from the uh, the other layers of the mainframe that's getting managed by your ESM. So in actual fact, um, you can bypass any rules ESM has in place and give yourself privileged access authority. If you know what you're doing and you have vulnerability ridden software residing in your OS layer or the OS itself. Um, Lastly, limiting system data set access to only a few trustworthy sysprocs keeps the mainframe secure. I mean, this is certainly something that you should be doing. Um, it's always a little bit scary. We talk about, and we will talk about the zero trust method here in a minute, but you know, people are out there that will bribe your staff for access to your mainframe and to your, just go create me a user account or leave your login line on the table type of thing. Doesn't happen often. You'd like to think it would never happen. It can happen, right? And there has been cases uh, in other organizations, not specifically on the mainframe, but in other systems where people have been paid off for these sort of things. So um, it's a difficult one, and it's a touchy subject for a lot of people. But of course, it can be uh, somewhere that you need to look at as well. So let's talk about Logica. I'm not picking on them, I promise. But this is the most clear documented mainframe hack ever reported. There are a few other ones out on the internet that they can look for, but Logica is the one a lot of people know about. Logica was a Swedish IT firm, and it provided tax services to the Swedish government and also Swedish banks, um, such as like the Swedish Nordea Bank. They managed their mainframe, in fact. So they were a managed service provider or an MSP for Nordea Bank. Over the course of a number of years, about kind of 2010 to 2012-ish range, a little bit before and a little bit after as well. A guy, I forget his name, he was actually co-founder of the Pirate Bay, and he had a couple of associates working with him, hacked into Logica's mainframe. When they hacked into the mainframe, they created multiple backdoors and they stole a ton of information. Some of the information included things like personal identity information and taxing authority records as well, right? So they stole a lot of pretty critical information. Some of the personal information that was stolen included like the new identity for people that were given protective identities, right? So some really critical information here that no one should have. Through WikiLeaks and then eventually FOI or Freedom of Information requests that were routed to the Swedish government. Details of this hack eventually were released out to the public. They are heavily redacted. as to not make it so obvious how to perform what they've done. But certainly there is a lot of information there online. And then they used various different methods for the hack, right? It wasn't just any one thing, including. But one of the things that they did, which I thought was interesting, was the exploitation of zero-day exploits. So a zero-day exploit could be design flaws in either ZOS itself, or operating system programs, APF authorized programs, right? So if there is a design flaw, if it is not coded up to IBM's standard, set, I think way back in the 80s, but IBM are usually very good at keeping to that standard. But sometimes you might have an APF authorized program from a vendor or from somewhere else that might actually still have vulnerabilities in it because it's been coded incorrectly. And these sort of things could be exploited to allow users to gain additional access authority, essentially giving them kind of like root access, but on the mainframe. You could stop your SMF records from being created. You can, browse any data that you want. You can turn off your batch. You can destroy the system, basically. They were found out and arrested, by the way. So yeah, this has all kind of been cleared up. I think Logica still on their feet, and things have improved since then. But anyway, this is documented. You can feel free to read it on the internet. People don't think, I hear a lot of people say Mainframe's never been hacked before. Well, this is an example you can now give them that's fairly well known. So you might ask yourself, and especially if you're coming from the distributed world, you might think to yourself, okay, well, in the distributed world, let's say we use open source tools. Let's take Git, for example. Every time there's a Git vulnerability published, uh, it's published on the National Vulnerability Database, the NVD's website. The patch comes out. Everybody knows about it. Everyone knows the TDSS score. And then you take the newest patch, you patch on your system. You're good to go, right? Well, IBM actually handles mainframe security and mainframe vulnerabilities differently than how it's handled on the distributed side. So a quote from IBM, IBM doesn't make security/integrity data public for IBM Z. This security portal provides a controlled notification distributed mechanism to ensure that critical information is available to only those Z clients that need to know. So basically what this is saying is if there's a big vulnerability that gets out there somehow, or if there's some sort of like exploit or hack, it's not going on IBM's website. They're not going to post it. No one's going to know except for those people that know, and then anyone else that's kind of talked about it, right? And so these things are kept under wraps, and that's all for security, right? You don't want to say, "Oh, hey, look, JP Morgan got hacked or whatever. Here's the details of it," right? You don't want that, of course. That would probably be illegal. But even when it comes to vulnerabilities or exploits in things like ZOS itself, the operating system, which have been found before, people at Rocket actually have found some in the past, and worked with IBM to get them resolved. Um, you know, if this was to happen and a vulnerability was to be found or exploited, the only people that would ever get told about that and get issued the patch are people on the relevant version that needs to know. So if you're on, I don't know, ZOS 2.6 and there's some vulnerability found in 2.3 with this specific setup, then only the people in 2.3 with this specific setup would be getting notifications and patches, right? They're not going to tell the whole world. They're not going to tell you that this has been found and here's what you need to do to patch this potential vulnerability. So that's kind of the point I'm getting at. If you want to be dramatic about it, you can call it something on the terms of the conspiracy of silence, because hacks are kept under wraps. They're only on a need to know basis. They're handled very differently than in the distributed world. And because of this, people have the general conception that the mainframes don't get hacked or there's not any vulnerabilities, when it's simply not the case. It's just kind of kept on the down low, and you don't really know too much about it. So, why is the mainframe vulnerable? We've talked a little bit about this, but there's also some things I may have missed. One is poorly designed or written code in the OS level can and has allowed breaches without any sort of ESM issuing a warning. So, like I said previously, you've got your operating system layer segregated from the rest of the mainframe system. Now, if you have anything in the operating system layer, which includes your operating system or APF authorized programs, for example, or PCs or SVCs, things like that, um, if they are coded improperly, they can be vulnerable and can be hacked. Essentially, they can be exploited by hackers. And that can be done behind the back of your ESM, behind the back of BRACF. Um, so you think, oh, well, surely they'll be coded properly. Well, you'd hope so. And IBM, for example, does a very good job of keeping ZOS very safe and secure the majority of the time. But as speaking from a vendor's perspective, vendors do not as much. And it's not because the vendors are bad or they're doing it on purpose, but vendors have a lot of software products they release. And this kind of comes into point number two here, that vendors, are doing maybe less QA testing on their software products and looking at the binary code, the low-level code of these products to make sure it's unexploitable. And this is because of maybe they have a strict time schedule to get the patches out, right? We live in an agile world. Everyone's pushing out updates and getting everything, um, out to the customer as quick as possible. But it also could be, again, we can take it back to the skills gap, Oh, the mainframe developers with 40 something years experience are really good at this sort of thing are retiring. Now we're getting in younger people, and they may not have the experience uh, to, you know, to write code that's not flawed, right? Or maybe they don't have the experience to look and during QA tests and test this and that way to make sure they have unexploitable codes. So certainly vendor software can be and has been a pretty uh, dangerous area for your mainframe, right? And also open source products as well, which we'll talk about again in a minute. Um, it also could be the resources are not allocated to maintain the ESM, leaving it open to executive access or data management issues. Again, with the skills gap conversation, what about your RACF support folks, or ACF2 or top secret? Um, Maybe people are retiring. Maybe the team's not as big as it used to be. Maybe you just don't have the resources to manage your large environment at your organization. Um, Maybe that allows more users to have access to data sets than they otherwise should have. Things like this definitely introduce a bit of a risk into your organization. Um, Written policies don't match actual implementation. Expected results are approved by the company, but the actual results are what's in effect. So you might have a security policy. Let's take a very easy example. You might have a security policy that tells you all users need to have passwords with 8 characters or more. Let's take it. It's a very simple one. Um, you know, that's all well and good having a policy there, but are you actually doing compliance audits to make sure that's the case? Um, in actual fact, and I've seen in the past, some organizations have, kind of 4 or 5 word um, character passwords on the mainframe, no multi-factor authentication, things like that. Um, this is in a direct stark contrast to what policies you may have in your organization. So, are your internal audits looking for the right things? Are you using compliancy tools to help you with this? There's compliancy tools in the market now that you can feed in standards. You can feed in either your written policy or something like a DISIS-DIG standard into the compliance tool, which will then compare that to kind of over 200 different measurements on the mainframe, and it will say, hey, look, 36 users have passwords out of compliance, and blah blah blah. Various other things that it's looking at. So, not every organization has the resources and capabilities to do this manually, but there are tools out there as well to help. Um, and so, you know, uh, maybe that's something you need to look into, especially with regulations like DORA coming in. You're actually going to get forced to. this kind of the cowboy method of it's fine. Yeah, we're doing it. Yeah, I think is maybe not going to be something that you can get away with in the future as we get more regulated. Again, management may also just think the mainframe is inherently secure because it doesn't get hacked. And then maybe you can go to them and say, well, I went on a GC session and this guy on the internet said that Logica got hacked, so we need to rip everything and replace it. So maybe not. But yeah, the myth is slowly getting busted here. So different regulations that may be impacting your mainframe environment. If you folks are end users, you'll probably hear a little bit about this, and it'll probably wind up with more projects and work coming onto your desk, which isn't very nice, but it is what it is. Some of them are listed here: GDPR, cyber resiliency, NIST, statistics, HIPAA, PCI DSS, DORA, as I say, EU orgs. But some UK orgs are definitely looking at DORA and considering it. I know that for a fact. More on the way. We're in a constantly changing landscape here, and more is coming. So, as an end user, are you taking steps to address some of these areas that we mentioned, right? Vulnerability scanning for systems, for your applications, for open source tools, for vendor software. Are you doing that today? If you're not doing that today, why are you not doing that today? And should you be doing that today? I would argue that you should. What about compliance audits and penetration testing? Some organizations do paper pen tests, right? You kind of write up what a pen test should look like. They're not doing a real pen test. Compliance audits, again, just talked about it. Hybrid cloud impacts on data security. This is a real interesting one. Everyone talks about hybrid cloud. If you're doing a lot of sessions at GSE UK this year or any other GSEs, you might go to a hybrid cloud session. I'm actually on one at 12 o'clock today, talking about hybrid cloud and integrating the mainframe with cloud and all these things. But how does that impact data security? And it's really quite a dangerous thing to do if you don't do it properly. If you're not encrypting your data when sending it off or on platform, virtualizing your data, exposing your mainframe data for applications on the cloud side or distributed side to interact with them. I mean, if you're not taking the correct approach, you could be potentially putting some really seriously confidential mainframe data out there to be looked at or hacked. Things like even moving data to public cloud. A lot of organizations I've spoke to are terrified of the public cloud, and rightly so. But some organizations are considering it, so you have to be really sure what information that you're sending over there is data, is information that can go in a public cloud, right? That's not anyone's, bank account details or something like that. We talked about it before, but excessive or unauthorized system access. Yeah, maybe people have too much access more than they should. I always think back to something like the Edward Snowden sort of incident there. Yeah, or maybe people have unauthorized system access. What about recovery from any sort of ransomware attacks? And this is maybe a conversation piece that stems outside of security, but I guess it's more resiliency, but it is still security. How are you recovering from ransomware attacks? Are you making your system more robust in the future to avoid things like that from happening again? Looking at zero-day vulnerabilities, this kind of comes into vulnerability scanning as well, right? Zero-day vulnerabilities that are unpatchable by yourselves. Maybe it could be flaws in vendor code for vendor software products. They can be exploitable if they're there. So how do you address finding them and dealing with them? Hardware and software upgrades as well is something that can leave you exposed. It's something that you need to handle with great care. And then, of course, how are you addressing outdated manual processes that may increase the risk of errors? Um, I mean, certainly, regulators demand more than just outdated manual processes. And what happens if the guy who used to do this is retired? Do you know how to do it still? So, yeah, risk of errors, gives risk to your systems. It's maybe not necessarily a security threat, but um, certainly don't want any downtime in your systems as well. You don't want any sort of weakness in your system's resiliency. Um, so absolutely important to keep on top of. So steps that you can take today to minimize your risk um, could be some of the following here. And I talked a little bit about it, but there's a thing that's called the zero trust security model. And zero trust really talks about identifying crucial assets that enable the business's objectives. So first you might say, okay, what's the business's objectives? Okay, that's my business's objectives. Now, what crucial assets are there to enable that business objective, right? And that could be, I don't know, your credit card systems or whatever the case may be. And then the associated assets are should be protected and managed extremely carefully, more carefully than anything else, because they are proper business deliverables right there, right? Um, so identifying, protecting crucial assets is one part of zero trust security model. But from a people perspective, zero trust is all about ensuring that users only have the minimum level of data access required to perform their job. So you don't want the sysprog. I mean, maybe a sysprog does, but you don't really want your sysprog to have access to everything, to be the god of the mainframe that can do whatever they like, um, because that can potentially lead to a lot of different issues. And God forbid that person decides to turn on the organization or take a bribe or something like that, you can lose a lot of critical data. So the idea is to give every user the minimum level of data access required to do their job. You can always extend the data access up temporarily for certain projects or issues. Um, this can be extended not only to data access, but to network access or even device access as well. And you can also implement things like certificate management and multi-factor authentication to really kind of ensure that your device access, for example, is strictly kind of narrowed down to certain individuals. So on the data topic, data classification, it is related to the zero trust model, but it's really important for your org to understand your data and from that able to classify the importance of your data. So you probably have sensitive data and you probably have critical data, but it might not be classified as such. I've actually read before that like there's a certain percentage of data in every org that's actually really important, but isn't classed as really important. Um, so it's really important to understand and to be able to trust your data, to then make sure that you classify it properly, and then from there manage it properly so that it doesn't get into the hands of someone who shouldn't be having it. Encryption, I mean, we're all pretty familiar with encryption. It's particularly important in, say, like hybrid cloud outcomes. Maybe you're pushing your mainframe data off into the cloud. Maybe you're getting rid of your VTL and you're moving all your mainframe tape backups to cloud backups, things like that. Cool things you can do in today's ever-changing landscape, but you got to make sure that data is encrypted, right? You can't have your cloud that you're backing up your data to be exploited and losing potential critical customer information that way. Implementing risk and governance programs is another one. It might seem like these sort of programs are designed to make your job harder as an end user, but in fact, they really are benefiting your organization from a safety perspective. Um, Things like being able to recognize and track and then eventually eliminate risks on your system. It really is critical. The whole risk lifecycle management is really important. But also, governance and software currency is really important too. So, are you using software that might be out of date, uh, or maybe open source tools that are unsupported or out of date, not been patched recently? Things like that. If you're not on top of your software currency, you're introducing risk into your environment. Unified endpoint management is another step you can take. The concept of UEM in this case is to use consistent software to allow your security teams to monitor, manage, and secure all your devices. So, like your laptop, your phone, tablet, whatever your organization uses, and allow them to manage it all from one central point, regardless of what operating system you're using, their location. And basically, by simplifying the management of all your devices, it makes your organization easier to implement security practices, to do audits, to manage all your devices in that way. So consistency is really key. It makes things a lot simpler and a lot easier to manage. Um, and you last about it before, but vulnerability scanning and penetration testing as well. You're going to need to do these things because of regulatory requirements. Um, But yeah, I mean, vulnerability scanning on its own is very interesting. And I talked before earlier about um, trusting the software that you download, right? Go to a vendor, maybe they've been a vendor that you've got a product off of for 20 years. It's a good product, but um, it can be exploitable, or perhaps even by getting a new patch to that software, it'll introduce a risk that can then be exploited into your and give a hacker a way into your operating system there. Um, you know, Again, if that happens, there's nothing your RACF or ESM can really do. So making sure that you trust the software that you're getting from these vendors is important. Some of the biggest banks in the world now are doing automated vulnerability scanning. Um, so they set up a vulnerability scanner to run at a certain interval, or sometimes they run it every time they get a patch. So you might have 100 software products. You might get a patch, you know, in on the second week of May, and then you run a scan to make sure, hey, look, has anything changed? Okay, no, we're good to go. And then we'll roll out that software product from your sandbox environment to your other, um, the other LPARs that you have. So yes, a lot of organizations are looking at doing this now. Um, as I say, some of the biggest banks in the world are doing this. Um, a lot of organizations in the UK are looking at doing this or are doing this today as well. And of course, penetration testing as well is a big one. Um, there's a lot of talks today about certificates required in mainframe penetration testing because mainframe penetration testing is kind of a new thing. It's been around for a while, but if a regulatory body of DORA people come in and say, "Hey, you got to pen test your mainframe," and you say, "Oh, we got the guys at Rocket to do it for us," they may ask for things like, "Oh, well, are they certified for this, certified for that?" So certifications come in to an important degree here as well. But the biggest thing is that you're confident in your systems, that you can tick the boxes for the regulatory requirements, but then also that you can be sure that your system isn't going to get exploited in any way. So this feels a little bit out of place, but the point I'm trying to make with this slide here is just to quickly look at the ZOS architecture and how a hacker could exploit it in a theoretical way. Um, so let me get my pointer here. So here you have your ZOS system. You've got your operating system layer here at the top. This is where ZOS sits. This is where your APF authorized programs sit, which includes your vendor software, which we talked about a lot. And then over here, we have things like your system programs, your system applications, maybe your COBOL programs, Kix applications, things like that. You've got your end user connecting to the mainframe here, via your network, and you've got your ESMs sitting here as well, right? Things like RACF. Um, Now, the way ZOS is architected is the OS layer is actually segregated from the rest. Um, but any sort of data request comes through calls or routines that get filtered through the OS layer. So it's kind of like the central hub, but it is segregated. Um, and so when I talked earlier about how if you hack, if you aim if you aim your exploit or your attack on the OS layer rather than aiming it at the application level where things are protected by your ESM, you can actually bypass ESM because it doesn't exist in this layer. So there has been examples of, and generally, if you get a mainframe pen test, your mainframe pen tester will do something along these lines, that they will be on your system with a basic level of access. They will look into the binary code of various different things in either operating system or maybe in vendor software APF authorized programs. And if they find something um, that they can essentially break into or exploit, they will, and they can get access to the OS layer. The OS layer at this point, again, segregated away from the ESM, but also gives you access to essentially everything, as all data requests are getting routed through operating system to get to your data layer, which isn't in this picture. So, um, yeah, it's a pretty important layer to keep secure and not one that a lot of organizations are looking at. And this is why things like vulnerability scanning is really becoming more important as more organizations realize this. Um, but yeah, just a little picture to kind of look and see that there's various different ways to hack, and there's various different ways to keep yourself safe. Network scanning, application scanning, of course, they're critical. Most organizations do it today. They are critical. Compliance, scanning, backup, database cleanup, really important. But also, what are you doing about your operating system? It's another uh, key aspect to your system that you really got to look at and make sure that you're protected. I know we're running out of time, but a couple more slides. In Rocket, we have a proprietary method of categorizing mainframe vulnerabilities. So this is an industry standard. This is what we do at Rocket. But we try to kind of frame it in the way that you would understand vulnerabilities in the distributed world as well. So when we look for mainframe vulnerabilities, these are the sort of things that we look for. Uh, Trapdoors. Trapdoor is maybe the most severe vulnerability that you can find. This essentially allows a hacker to make changes directly to your environment. So it's pretty dangerous. We got storage alteration vulnerabilities. These are pretty severe as well. They're less direct than trapdoors, but as they don't really give hackers like the ability to totally control your environment. But they can provide maybe like non-authorized users with the ability to alter some or maybe all virtual memory, which can lead to a lot of bad outcomes. System instabilities. This could be vulnerabilities that could be exploited to, at the worst case, cause your system to crash. Could be pretty dangerous. There's least privilege vulnerabilities that may exist. This allows unauthorized users to get privilege escalation, potentially leading to them to access files or system resources that they otherwise shouldn't be able to access. Storage reference vulnerabilities are ones that allow unauthorized users to exfiltrate sensitive data, right? So you're not even getting access to the data, but you're exfiltrating it from protected storage. And then you've got identity spoofing. So this can be a vulnerability actually found in the ESM. So not all of them are the operating system layer, but some like this are in ESM, which allows unauthorized users to escalate privileges as well. So we do regularly find multiple vulnerabilities at customer sites under these categories. In fact, Rocket, over I think about kind of 14 years of doing vulnerability scanning, has only once ever found a customer site that never had any vulnerabilities. Only once in 14 years. So yeah, your organization will have something in there. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it's really bad. Uh, and it's probably sitting there today and nobody knows about it, but it's there. So it's really interesting. But yeah, one site that no vulnerabilities were ever found in 14 years. And a little bit more about Rocket, about Rocket in this space. Rocket inherited, or I guess bought a company called KRI Security Key Resource Incorporated. Um, and since then, we've been working together uh, for a couple of years now. Key Resources Incorporated have their roots in ACF2, which is the RACF equivalent um, created by SIA Broadcom. So we have ex-ACF2 developers working for us. Initially, we were kind of experts in the conversion of ACF2 and top secret to RACF, or vice versa, if you want to go to RACF, so CAs to ESM products. However, over the years, we became a little bit more involved in other things than just ESM conversions. Things like compliance scanning, vulnerability scanning, um, RACF database cleanup, security consulting, things like that. So we do a number of different things in this space now with over 10 security architects and kind of 30 plus years of proprietary tooling. So this is where some of the stats and kind of information that I talked about came from. We do have sometimes more focused sessions with Ray Overby, who was the founder of KRI. He still works for us today. He was at GSC UK last year as well, if you were lucky and got to go and attended the sessions. A really knowledgeable guy, could tell you a whole lot more about the inner workings of a mainframe hack. But yeah, that's Rocket. That's us on the scene. And you might think, why would you go to Rocket? Who are Rocket? We're a rapidly growing organization now in the mainframe security and storage and hybrid cloud spaces. We are a mainframe organization, and we pride ourselves on products and services that are easily usable, but have a breadth of support, have a minimal overhead, and allow you to manage risks in your organization. But I planned on this being about 40 minutes or so I've gone way over, rambled too much, but that's me. We've got a couple other sessions later today. We've got an AI-driven insights session. We've got a data recovery session. I'm also on a session at 12, a lunch and learn, where we're talking about hybrid cloud solutions. So how do you, not really solutions, but more so how do you bring your mainframe into a hybrid cloud world? How do you manage that? What can you do theoretically? Things like that. So there's a QR code on your bottom left if you do want to learn more about our hybrid cloud solutions. Otherwise, hope to see you at the other sessions. And if you've got any questions, please just pop them in the chat or come off mute if you can.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I've unmuted, asked the room to unmute. So if anybody has any questions, please do ask away or ask in the chat and I'll field them.
I'll put in the chat my email address just in case if anyone maybe doesn't want to ask in front of the crowd any questions. You'd rather email it to me, happy if you do that as well.
I don't think there's any questions, so we can wrap up 5 minutes early. But thank you very much for a very interesting session. And to the audience, please ask that you'll fill out the feedback for Michael, so you can get your thoughts on his session. I look forward to seeing you all throughout the day. Thanks very much, Michael.
Thank you, and thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.